Hello, thanks for joining me. For those of you new to this channel, my name is Mindy Mandell, and each week I talk about one of Plato's dialogues. So as you can see, today we're looking at the Statesman. This is actually the second of two videos on the Statesman, so if you haven't seen the first one, I do recommend you watch that first, and I'll link it above. As you see here, this video is called Weaving the Warp and the Woof. Now, for those of you who have not yet read this dialogue, if you're watching this in place of reading, or if this is your preparation for reading, this title won't make any sense to you, but just hang in there. By the end, it will. All right, well, let's get into it. So we're looking at the Statesman. We saw last week that this dialogue carries on from the Sophist. And the Sophist, as the name implies, they were looking for the definition of the Sophist. In the Statesman, they're looking for the definition of the statesman. And by the way, some translators call it politicus. So you may have seen that title as well. It's the same dialogue. Okay, so last week we saw that they came up with a preliminary definition of statesmanship, and they defined it as the science of shepherding mankind. And by the way, all of the translations that I'm using from this dialogue are from J.B. Skemp. Okay, so they came up with this definition but agreed that it was too general, and that brought us into the tangent of the myth of the Age of Cronus, which I covered last week. So now they're carrying on from here. They want to hone in this definition, get a little more precise. And at one point, the stranger even goes so far as to say that not only was that previous definition too general, but they actually made a mistake. He says, I think we really went wrong at this point in our earlier definitions. We made a confusion, a needlessly stupid one, of the king and the tyrant. And these are entirely different people, differing in the manner of their rule. So here, king in the best sense of the word, not our, when we think of kings like in actual reality, they don't meet up with that ideal definition, but he's using it in the ideal sense. And so like the good shepherd of mankind versus the worst possible shepherd of mankind. And they both fit that general definition. So they really have to hone it in a lot. And that's where that whole myth came in. That's why he went off on that tangent. We'll see today how he's going to finally, by the end, tie in that myth to what we look at today. But then he's going to go off on yet another tangent. And we have seen in other dialogues as well that Plato loves his tangents. The tangents, of course, are not really tangents. They're tangents for the characters in the story, but not for us, because Plato is giving us information that we absolutely need when he's going to go back into his main discussion. So here we're looking at standards of measurement. They have a bit of a long conversation, and then they come to this conclusion. We must posit two types and two standards of greatness and smallness. We must not assert, as we did just now, that the only standard possible is that of relative comparison. We have just seen how we must amend the statement. The standard of relative comparison will remain, but we must acknowledge a second standard, which is a standard of comparison with the due measure. Now, this phrasing, due measure, is actually just pointing to the idea of absolute realities. So if we only stay in the world of relative comparison, we're staying only in our physical world, and there is no absolute truth, if that were true. If we stay with relative comparison, we can never look towards an absolute truth. So he says there is an additional postulate on which we must insist, and it is this. Excess and deficiency are measurable not only in relative terms, but also in respect of attainment of a norm or due measure. For if we cannot first gain assent on this postulate, we are bound to fail if we advance the claim that a man possesses statecraft, or indeed that a man possesses any other of the special forms of knowledge that function in human society. Now, what he's coming to here with this idea of special forms of knowledge that function in human society, we're going to see he's going to start talking about the arts. When one day we come to give a full exposition of true accuracy in dialectic method, we shall find the need of this postulate concerning the due measure which we have just enunciated. However, the statement in the form that we have made it and with the demonstration adequate for the present purposes which we've given of it is a very great help to us, or so it seems to me. And here's the key line. It shows that two propositions stand or fall together. And here are the two propositions. The first is that the arts exist. And the second is that excess and deficiency are measurable not only relatively, but in terms of the realization of a norm or due measure. Thus, if measure in the second sense exists, then so do the arts. And conversely, if there are arts, then there is this second kind of measurement, namely the due measure. To deny either is to deny both. Okay, let's pause for a moment to look at why this is true. When Plato talks about arts, he's talking about a special body of knowledge which, when applied, benefits the recipient. He often uses doctor as the example, that the doctor's body of knowledge is to benefit the patient. The doctor gets no benefit. And so that's why doctors charge money, so that they get something in return. But all of the arts, as Plato discusses them, fall into this definition. So the idea of liberal arts is a little different than what he's talking about. So this is specifically what he means when he talks about art. And for those of you who want to see this in more detail or want to brush up, those of you who've seen my past videos, I do talk about this in the first video of the Republic, of my series of videos on the Republic. It's in book 1. There's a long section about art, and so I discuss it in more detail there. Now, these arts, because there's a special body of knowledge, and for Plato, we also saw in the Republic, the objects in, or the absolute realities in the intelligible realm are the only true objects of knowledge. And therefore, when he talks about a body of knowledge, he's talking about absolute realities. We must draw from absolute truth, goodness, beauty, justice, and so on, in order to really apply these arts properly. And so if the arts exist, then so does this measure of this absolute measure, this absolute standard. And if this absolute standard exists, then there must be a way to bring it into our realm. And so that's the arts. And so the two exist together. Measurement is involved in all that is brought into being, for all activities directed by arts involve measurement in some form or another. But our friends, and here he's referring to materialists, people who believe that the physical world is all that is real. And for all of their erudition, they've not been trained to study things by dividing them into real classes. And as a result, here we find them confusing these two types of measurement, which are in fact so different, just because they have judged them to be of like nature. So if you're a materialist, then you do not really believe in absolute realities, or you think that they're still just concepts. And so you're going to confuse the relative and the absolute forms of measurement. Okay, then he's going to go on to talk about why we're even looking for the statesman in the first place. And he gives an example of teaching elementary school kids how to read. And he says, suppose someone asked us this question about our class of elementary school children learning to read. When a child is asked what letters spell a word, it can be any word you please. Are we to regard this exercise as undertaken to discover the correct spelling of the particular word the teacher set? Or is it designed rather to make the child better able to deal with all words that he or she may be asked to spell? Well, surely we reply that the purpose is to teach the kids to read all the words. How then does this principle apply to our present search for the statesman? Why did we set ourselves the problem? Is our chief purpose to find the statesman, or have we the larger aim of becoming better philosophers, more able to tackle all questions? Well, here too the answer is clear. We aim to be able to solve all problems. Okay, so keeping this broader purpose in mind, They go on to talk about what the stranger is calling here the highest and most important class of existence. And here he's talking about absolute realities such as goodness, justice, beauty. He says that for these existence, there are no corresponding visible. Sorry, there, I got a little tongue-tied. Let me start over. But to the highest and most important class of existence, there are no corresponding visible resemblances. No work of nature clear for all to look upon. In these cases, nothing visible can be pointed out to satisfy the inquiring mind. The instructor cannot cause the inquirer to perceive something with one or other of his senses, and so make him really satisfied that he understands the thing under discussion. Therefore, we must train ourselves to give and to understand a rational account of every existent thing. And this last line here is really the important one because this is dialectic. And then he goes on to say that we must value first and foremost, above all else, the philosophical method itself, which is dialectic, and this consists in ability to divide according to real forms. Now, our interlocutor here, which is the young Socrates we met last week, he says, according to our former argument, it is only the man possessed of the art of kingship who must be called a king, though he is just as much a king when he is not in power as when he is. You very rightly recalled that point. I think it follows that if the art of government is to be found in this world at all in its pure form, it will be found in the possession of one or two, or at most a select few. Few things here. First of all, one point that I have made many times but haven't made recently is that Plato used male nouns and pronouns, but of course everything he's saying applies to women as well. But here, of course, again, when he's talking about the king or kingship, it's very much like what we saw in the Republic about the philosopher king there. And we're going to see a lot of parallels to the Republic. In fact, every dialogue of Plato's that deals with politics, we can think of the Republic and apply that here. There was the analogy there of the city-state to the soul. And we saw that even though on the surface, the Republic is about building an actual physical republic, what it was really about was the soul. And we can apply that same analogy to any of Plato's dialogues that deal with politics. We'll see it here. We saw it in Menexenus. We'll see it in the Laws, which is a dialogue I haven't yet covered. But here what he's saying is a point that he also made in the Republic, that what he's really talking about is a state of mind, a condition of soul. The true king is not necessarily the job title of king, but it is a state of mind in which a person is acting from wisdom. They're drawing from that absolute standard of measurement of goodness, beauty, justice, and so on. And they are carrying a pattern of that in their soul. And that is what guides them as they act in the world. That's the philosopher king. And we're going to see that that's also our statesman here. And the stranger then says, yes, you got the point correctly. So long as they work on a reasoned scientific principle following essential justice, that means absolute justice, justice in itself, and they act to preserve and improve the life of the state so far as may be, we must call them real statesmen according to our standards of judgment, the absolute standard, and say that the state they rule alone enjoys good government and has a real constitution. Now remember, the king may not actually be a job title, which means the state they rule in that case, if it's not your job, means your soul, your own self. Or it could be also, you can extend it to maybe your family, to if you're a manager or a boss at work, to your employees. So this is the standard then, that you must look to absolute justice, right here translated as essential justice, justice in itself. Now a reminder here that all of this whole discussion from the sophist through the statesman was built on this statement right here by Socrates, asking about the sophist, the statesman, and the philosopher. Are these three different people, or is there any overlap? And now we're starting to understand why we don't need another dialogue called the philosopher, because the statesman and the philosopher have a great deal of overlap. Okay. In one sense, it is evident that the art of kingship does include the art of lawmaking. But the political ideal is not full authority for laws, but rather full authority for a man or woman who understands the art of kingship and has kingly ability. Do you understand why? Young Socrates does not. Let me pause here for a moment. So now he's going to go on to another point, carrying on this whole image that we saw from the Republic. If we understand that the statesman and the philosopher are basically the same person, then this will make a lot more sense, because what he was talking about in the Republic, again, carrying that pattern in the soul and letting that be what guides you. And that's what he's talking about here. Law can never issue an injunction binding on all, which really embodies what is best for each. It cannot prescribe with perfect accuracy what is good and right for each member of the community at any one time. The differences of human personality, the variety of men's activities, and the inevitable unsettlement attending all human experience make it impossible for any art whatsoever to issue unqualified rules holding good on all questions at all times. So Plato here recognizing that living a spiritual life is not one size fits all, and we have to be careful not to let that living practice become solidified and codified into dogma. We may say then that there is only one constitution in the true sense, the one we've described. For the rest of them owe their very preservation to their following a code of laws enacted for this true state, and to a strict adherence to a rule which we admit to be desirable, though it falls short of the ideal. So this is the idea of maybe a living practice after some time becomes codified, and then it starts to become more rigid. But it's only the true state is the one that is the flowing, living, moving one. The rule that none of the citizens may venture to do any act contrary to the laws, and that if any of them ventures to do such acts, the penalty is to be death or the utmost rigor of punishment. This is the justest and most desirable course, as a second best, when the ideal we've just described has been set aside. Well, obviously, if you take this literally, it is really harsh, it is hardly just or desirable. But what he's pointing out here is that with the way we can apply this to us as students of spiritual practice, or looking at this as the government of the soul, we can see that the ideal is to be your own guide, to follow that whole path of the person going up out of the cave and into the upper world and then going back down and so on. So the person who is carrying that pattern in their soul and is able to live by it and really practice wisdom in a living, fluid way, that's the ideal, of course. But falling short of that, we should find somebody who can guide us. And that's the second best. But then he does warn us that the point of a guide, and we're going to see in just a moment here, actually in this quote here, the point of a guide is to help us eventually reach that point where we don't need that guidance anymore, where that guidance is coming from within. When we prefer the written word over the living word, if you will, then that's where it becomes a problem. And so he says, if a man be found guilty of inquiry into seamanship or medicine in contravention of this law, action must be taken to suppress him. First, we must deny him the title of doctor or captain. Instead, we must call him a man with his head in the clouds, one of those chattering sophists. And furthermore, it will be lawful for any citizen so desiring to indict him before the court of justice, or what passes for such a court, on the charge of corrupting the younger men and influencing them to go in for seamanship and medicine in an illegal manner, by setting up as doctors or captains on their own authority. So you can see here there are many references here to what happened to Socrates, right? He was charges were brought against him. He was accused of corrupting the youth. He was accused of believing in different gods from those of Athens. Even this idea of having his head in the clouds or being told that, that's also a reference to Socrates. A contemporary playwright of his day was a man named Aristophanes, who wrote a number of comedy plays, and he has one called The Clouds, which you can actually find online in English. I'm sure you can find a free one. And in this comedy, he is making fun of, it's believed to be Socrates, that he's making fun of a spiritual teacher who's supposedly got his head in the clouds, or a spiritual philosopher. And that's why it's called The Clouds, because he's got his head in the clouds. So that's probably also a reference to Socrates as well. And by the way, Plato did include a character, Aristophanes, in one of his dialogues. That's the Symposium. And Aristophanes in that dialogue is the one who introduced the idea of looking for our missing half. It's an idea that Socrates cut down in just one sentence and dismissed. And also in that dialogue, just for good measure, Plato gave Aristophanes the hiccups. So I think it's fair to say he didn't like that guy. So yeah, the warning here is that it's good to follow a guide and sometimes the written word, whether you're following, if you find a teacher in this life or you turn to like Plato or, past teachers who wrote wisdom literature. It's good to turn to those teachers, but the point is not to stick to their word. It's to develop yourself so that you are at the point where you can function as the philosopher king or the statesman. Laws would seem to be written copies of scientific truth in the various departments of life they cover. Copies based as far as possible on the instructions received from those who really possess the scientific truth on these matters. In other words, the written word is at best right opinion. If you're following the books or you're following a teacher, you've got right opinion. But it's only the person who can draw that wisdom from themselves who has knowledge, and what he's calling here scientific truth. The man with the real knowledge, which is the true statesman, so now it's clear that that's what he means, will in many instances allow his activities to be dictated by his art and pay no regard to written prescriptions. He will do this whenever he is convinced that there are measures which are better than the instructions he previously wrote and sent to people at a time when he could not be there to control them personally. Yes, that was what we said. So an individual or a group who possess a code of laws but try to introduce some change in them because they consider it an improvement are doing the same thing according to their lights as the true statesman. The word lights here is not quite clear, but yes, it'll become clear in the next quote. So we all try to function as the true statesman, of course, some of us, and then of course some of us do it better than others. If they acted like this, meaning the past quote here, making changes on their own, if they acted like this with minds unenlightened by knowledge, they would indeed try to copy the true original, but would copy it very badly. If, on the other hand, they possess scientific knowledge, it would no longer be a case of copying at all. It would be the real and original statesmanship we are talking about. Okay, so that's to clarify it. So the key here of whether you're a good statesman or a bad one is knowing knowledge, being enlightened by knowledge, and that's why the word light was used in the previous quote. So now, of course, through all of this, you could understand knowledge in the conventional sense of the kind of knowledge we pick up in a university class, for example. But remember that for Plato, the absolute realities in the intelligible realm are the only true objects of knowledge. And that's what he's referring to when he talks about scientific knowledge, as he does throughout this whole dialogue. Right. Therefore, all who take part in one of these governments, and he had named a few different ones, apart from the one based on real knowledge, are to be distinguished from the true statesman. So only the person who knows true knowledge can be the true statesman. So that is why the statesman is the same as the philosopher king. But those people who fall short of this knowledge, they're not statesmen, they're just party leaders. And they're leaders of bogus governments. And they themselves, they're as bogus as their systems. The supreme imitators and tricksters, that's what they are. And of all the sophists, they are the arch-sophists. So very harsh. So there we see again our three terms that we were looking at: the sophist, the statesman, and the philosopher. And the statesman in the middle, it's quite fitting to be in the middle. When the statesman is truly functioning as a true statesman, then it's the same as the philosopher. But the false statesman is a sophist. There is such a thing as learning the principles of music or the principles of any of the crafts, is there not? Yes. But are we willing to admit that there exists an art of a higher order, also concerned with this process of acquiring special skills? Now, the second art is the one whose province is to decide whether or not we ought to learn any particular art. Yes, young Socrates says, we will attest the existence of an art of this higher order. So now that the stranger has set up who this statesman is, now he's going to make it even more precise by showing that not all of the arts are equal. The statesman is a higher art than all of the others. So he speaks of three different arts. I didn't pull out quotes of those because of the length of this, but he talks about rhetoric, he talks about generalship as in military, he talks about the judiciary. And then, because these are all part of running a city-state, right? So if you will view the three arts we have spoken of as a group with a common character, you will be bound to see that none of them has turned out to be itself the art of statesmanship. And this is because it is not the province of the real kingly art to act for itself, but rather to control the work of the arts which instruct us in the methods of action. The kingly arts control them according to its power to perceive the right occasions for undertaking and setting in motion the great enterprises of states. The other arts must do what they are told to do by the kingly art. Okay, now just as we saw in the Republic, we can bring that same analogy here. And if you have that dual understanding of both the macro level, looking at groups of people, and also the personal level, looking at one individual soul, if you can see that dual meaning throughout the quotes that are to come, it will make a lot more sense and have more meaning to you. So remember that in the Republic we saw the tripartite soul. We saw there are three parts of the soul, but it is the wisdom-loving part that should guide it. And so that wisdom-loving part is here called the kingly art, or what it does is the kingly art, according to this dialogue. It is what controls the other two. The other two parts should willingly fall in line with wisdom. There is an art which controls all these arts. It is concerned with the laws and with all that belongs to the life of the community. It weaves all into a unified fabric with perfect skill. It is a universal art, and so we call it by a name of universal scope. That name is one which I believe to belong to this art and to this alone, the name of statesmanship. Okay, so here we have a nice, concise definition of statesmanship. There's a lot of overlap with the quote just before it, but he does bring in the word weaving. And so this image of weaving brings us back to the title of today's video, and so we're going to weave that into our discussion now. He says, now that all the classes of arts active in the government of the state have been distinguished, shall we go on to scrutinize statesmanship and base our scrutiny of it on the art of weaving, which provides our example for it? Well, most certainly, that's an obvious analogy. And the stranger goes on to say that we must describe the kingly weaving process. What is it like? How is it done? And what is the fabric that results from its labors? So from here, then the stranger is going to be weaving together two of the virtues. He's going to focus on courage and what in this translation is called moderation. I've also used the term temperance. Other translations use also sound-mindedness. The Greek word is sophrosun. It does not translate well, and that's why different translators choose different words, but they're all talking about the same thing, sophrosun. I do have a video on the virtues. I think it's actually the very first one that I did, so you can find that in the playlist. It goes through in more detail what the four virtues are and how they fit together. Also, Book 4 of the Republic focused on the virtues, so that's another place to look. But what we're seeing here about these two, the reason these two in particular are pulled out is because the temperament of a person who's strong in courage or one who's strong in sophrosun, I'll just call it sophrosun, they have in some ways opposing personalities. He says this pair of virtues are in a certain sense enemies from of old, raged in opposition to each other in many realms of life. Now, of course, they both are positive things because they're both virtues. Courage is positive in the sense that we admire speed and intensity and vivacity in many forms of action and under all kinds of circumstances. But sophrosun is also a virtue. On the other hand, do we not quite often find ourselves approving gentleness and quietness when it is shown in many kinds of human behavior? So we like these both. However, when either one of them is excessive in a person, then it becomes something of a problem. If speed and swiftness are excessive and unseasonable, and if the voice is harsh to the point of being violent, we speak of all these as excessive and even maniacal. Unseasonable heaviness, slowness, and softness we call cowardly or indolent, and one can generalize further. The very classes, energy and moderation, are ranged in mutual exclusiveness and in opposition to each other. It is not simply a case of conflict between these particular manifestations of them. They never meet in the activities of life without causing conflicts. And if we pursue the matter further by studying people whose characters come to be dominated by either of them, we shall find inevitable conflict between them and the people of the opposite type. Okay, now again, I just want to remind you that there is a dual way in which to read this. There is the macro level, which is the way he's writing it on the surface, but also you can think about these virtues within the soul and the different parts of the soul, the three parts of the soul, and how they would fit together in a unison, because getting that unity was the key to the healthy soul in of the philosopher king that we saw in the Republic, and we're going to see it here as well. Okay, and that brings us finally to this analogy of weaving to understanding the soul, and so the warp and the woof. So the warp, so in weaving, one direction of the yarn is the warp, and then the cross yarn is the woof, and that's really all you need to know about weaving, so don't worry if you don't know any more than that. And the warp is stronger than the woof. That was also mentioned. So that's why warp is compared to courage and the woof to sophrosun. It's the softer material. So now we're going to see how he develops this. The art of weaving hands over the materials it intends to use for the fabric to the carders and others concerned with the preparatory processes, and yet it watches their work at every stage, retaining the direction and oversight itself, and indicating to each auxiliary art such duties as it deems that each can usefully perform to make ready the threads for its own task of fashioning the web. So just as we saw before with the idea of statesmanship being a higher art than the others, the one that oversees it, so we're going to set up weaving in the same way. And so with that in mind, we're going to go back to statesmanship. It takes over all the rest, all those who under the training process do in fact achieve sufficient nobility of character to stand up to the royal weaving process, and yet to submit to it while it combines them all scientifically into a unity. Those in whom courage predominates will be treated by the statesman as having the firm warp-like character, as one might call it. The others will be used by him for what we may likewise call the supple, soft, and woof-like strands of the web. He then sets about his task of combining and weaving together these two groups, exhibiting their mutually opposed characters. Again, it could be on the macro level, and it can also be within one person. He first unites that element in their souls, which is supernatural, by a divine bond, since this element in them is akin to the divine. After this supernatural link will come the natural bond, human ties, to supplement the divine ones. So now we're finally bringing in the myth of the Age of Cronus, because we saw that the Age of Cronus was symbolical of experiencing absolute reality, or knowing things in themselves, that divine connection that we have, that all humans have, that our souls are divine. When there arises in the soul of men a right opinion concerning what is good, just, and profitable, and what is the opposite of these, an opinion based on absolute truth, and settled as an unshakable conviction, I declare that such a conviction is the manifestation of the divine occurring in a race which is, in truth, of supernatural lineage. So I think in the myth it was called the earthborn race. The people who were born of that race, of that era, the Age of Cronus, that was, again, symbolical of us, of every one of us. We can have that experience. When we touch that realm, then we are like that earthborn race. We are of a supernatural lineage. And so knowing that, experiencing that, and having that be your reality is what he's talking about here. Do we realize that it is the true statesman, in that he is the good and true lawgiver, who alone is able, for who else should possess the power, to forge by the wondrous inspiration of the kingly art this bond of true conviction, uniting the hearts of the young folk in whom we were speaking just now, the young folk who have profited as they should from their education. So you can apply this to the wise leader in government and business and so on, but also within ourselves, the wise part of ourselves, the wisdom-loving part of the soul, weaving together the two other parts of the soul, bringing the whole soul into a wise unity. The soul, full of vigor and courage, will be made gentle by its grasp of this truth, and there is nothing as well calculated as this to make it a willing member of a community based on justice. And so their justice is brought in. So we have courage and sophistry are the two being woven together. Wisdom is what is guiding them. And this is a community based on justice. Now, here we have this quote here is showing that the courageous soul can be made gentle. There are other quotes I didn't pull out that show that the gentle soul can become more courageous as it's coming into this proper unity. The moderate natures look for a partner like themselves, and so far as they can, they choose their wives from women of this quiet type. When they have daughters to bestow in marriage, once again they look for this type of character in the prospective husband. And the courageous class does just the same thing and looks for others of the same type. So all this is going on, but actually throughout all of this, both types should be doing exactly the opposite. Instead of finding someone like themselves, they should be finding their complement. And again, you can see this both on the macro level and within our own souls. And he goes on to say that there is no difficulty in forging these human bonds, that complementary bond, if the divine bond has been forged first. In other words, if we're guided by the wisdom-loving part of the soul, if we're guided by true knowledge of absolute realities, then we will understand that we need this balance and we will be drawn to it rather than people of similar character. And so that brings us to the end here. So what we saw here in looking for the statesman is that what Plato was also doing is bringing the four virtues from the Republic and putting them into action, showing how they function together. He gave us courage and sophistry, and he showed them woven together, guided by wisdom. They were in a unity and order that is just. And so that brings us to the end of the Statesman. If you like what you saw, I do hope that you will hit the like button. It only takes a second. And also, if you have any questions or comments, you can leave a comment below. You can also send me an email. There is an email address in the description box. And also, if you don't already subscribe, please think about it. I do put out new videos about once a week, and you'll get a notification of that the next time I have a video out. The next dialogue I plan to cover is one called Phylubus. It's a very important one in Plato's work and one of his more popular ones, I think. So I do hope that you will join me for that. Thank you very much.